So in this panel, we're going to dive into the work of the UK Tech Cluster Group, which is an alliance of trade bodies like Manchester Digital, who are working in some of the UK's most buoyant clusters. And we'll look at the 7 recommendations from the recovery roadmap that group has produced, and discuss how we'd like to see them taken forward by central and regional government. So like to welcome David Dunn, who's the CEO of Sunderland Software and the chair of the cluster. Ben Shorrock, MD of Techspark based in Bristol, who's currently having a few issues joining us, I think, and Katie, our own MD. So, David, if you can tell us why the group was formed, what the thinking behind it was, and what makes it unique.
Okay, thanks, Alison. Hello, everybody. Yeah, the reason we set up the UK Tech Cluster Group was probably born out of frustration, if I'm being perfectly honest. What we found that all of the UK Tech Cluster Group members were essentially going through the same things, but just in different geographic areas. And there was a huge frustration that, and I'll be perfectly honest with this, a lot of us were making the same mistakes, but just in different areas and not finding out about those mistakes before we'd made them. So we came together as the UK Tech Cluster Group initially to share ideas and to share lessons learned. And I think most importantly from the Tech Cluster Group point of view, and one of the things that makes us unique is we share failures, which is very unusual in a peer group to kind of explain what you've done, why it hasn't worked, and what you could have done better. I think the other real benefit that we have is we understand ecosystems. I'm not quite sure where that sound's coming from.
Sounds like very odd. It's like we're in the middle of the best party ever.
I know. We're just about to move into
Sorry, guys, this is because I've let the team actually come in and talk to each other for once. So I'm going to mute myself and tell them all to be quiet.
Right, I'll continue. So, sharing lessons between us was absolutely a fundamental reason for setting up. But there's also a secondary benefit of we understand the ecosystems in which we work. We kind of understand the pulse that's happening on the ground. And one of the benefits we can bring by talking to each other about that is we can also share it with other parties. And we've realized that we can share quite a lot of our insight, our learning, and our understanding with government. And despite the fact we're in a very abnormal situation at the minute with pandemic and Brexit and everything else, governments seem to have been somewhat interested in the things we've got to say. And I always suggest that we do 3 things when we interact with government. We share them feedback and understanding from our ecosystems, so that will hopefully influence some of the decisions they make. We push back and push forward ideas in terms of what new policy features might look like or what new projects and programs might look like. And the third thing is we will help things land. Long gone is the day when government put out policy and companies in our ecosystems just go, what's that? What's it meant to do? How is it meant to benefit us? So we become that transition between government policy and government action and the ecosystems on the ground. Because the thing that connects all of our organizations is we all care what the tech ecosystems are in our areas. We care what the new SMEs are doing. We care what the existing and growing and scale up SMEs are doing. And we just need to make sure that message goes backwards and forwards correctly. So I hope, maybe not in a succinct fashion, I've given a little bit of an overview of who we are and why we formed.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Interesting that the things that we do wrong and the failures that we have are part of of how we share, which is of course a very digital thing to do. Could you tell us what you think the biggest success of the cluster is so far? What's the biggest thing you've landed? Of the group, sorry.
I think one of the key things, and I'll give Ben the plaudits for this because it was his idea. Is we did a conference. I can't even remember when we did it now. I think it must have been August. June. Oh, there you go. Time flies when you're having fun.
Time, yeah.
But we organised a conference that I think had something in excess of 350 delegates from local authorities from across the country, and we organised it in 2 weeks, I think. And the purpose behind doing that was because local authorities were placing more emphasis on looking at the tech sector as a way for economic recovery, but also, looking at the tech sector as a way for digital adoption. And they didn't, in their own admission, they didn't know what to do and how to plan it. So that pulling that event together and sharing some ideas and sharing some recommendations, I think permeated a lot of thoughts across the country very, very quickly. So that to me is our interim success. True success will be, are those ideas actioned?
So this is the 7 recommendations.
Yeah, I can share those.
Perfect. So this is the output of that event, of that conference, of the 7 recommendations that the group feel would be the most significant. Is it possible that you can summarize them for us?
I think we've done well putting them on one page there. I mean, I think it's important to highlight the fact that these weren't recommendations that the group bestowed on all of the audience. These were recommendations that came out of the audience having discussions at the event, which I think is very important. I don't think ideas and concepts should just come from a limited number of individuals. This came from a whole group. I think really the key things that we're focusing on are, where can digital benefit an economy by being a sector in its own right? So how do we get more tech startups? And that by definition brings hopefully wealth, hopefully employment. And then how can digital act as a horizontal enabler? How can it make productivity, efficiency, and customer engagement happen in other sectors, whether they be commercial sectors such as manufacturing, or whether they be services such as social services or healthcare? So, I'm not going to read all of the 7 out, but they're the 2 distilling factors that I think are core in what we're recommending.
To add to that, David, I think one of the things that was really interesting and useful, and maybe as a silver lining in all of this, is for a long time it feels like government and a lot of industries have thought digital is the future. And one of the things that COVID has maybe shown a lot of people is digital isn't the future, digital is the present. And all of the recommendations are very much about saying the only way we're going to cope, the only way we're going to grow, the only way we're going to build our resilience is to have the right people and the right programs and the right businesses able to utilize technology. And that's sort of a cut through of the report, but also a sort of key underpinning of all of the organizations that are here, because on a day by day, certainly we here down in the Southwest, but I know Katie and her team and David and his team see these amazing businesses doing amazing things, and we don't necessarily shout about them and celebrate them as much as we could do. So in an odd way, COVID has had very few silver linings.
Oh, it's certainly the case. I've never seen digital thought about and talked about outside our own sector in quite the way it is now. Katie, do you think that there's a danger that we're putting too much pressure on ourselves as a sector in a way? I mean, I don't know that we're typically going to be the saviours of everything.
I think it depends, actually. I don't think we're putting too much pressure on ourselves. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think there's always a danger with governments, both regional and national, that they take a one-size-fits-all approach to everything. And if digital is the saviour, then there will be one way of promoting it or funding it to be the saviour, and it won't necessarily be the right thing. And I think for the UK Tech Cluster Group particularly, one of the really strong messages we give to government is not all regions are the same, not all regions have the same priority. So if you want these ecosystems to grow and take the rest of the economy with them, then you need to understand them at the kind of level and complexity that all of our organisations understand them at. And you need to be able to do that to kind of pull the right levers to grow them. Otherwise, you do risk it being government talking to Google, Facebook, and assume that, the tech sector is made up of massive organisations. Whereas we all know from being in the regions that it's absolutely the reverse. We are an industry of mostly small companies with a heavy reliance on freelancers, etc. So you have to be able to impact a whole ecosystem, not just part of it, if you want everyone to benefit.
And do you think that message is getting across? Do we have evidence that it is?
We have occasionally, we get signed, someone, a minister or a civil servant will say something to us that gives us hope. Sometimes it's false hope. So I think progress is slow. It's been very difficult, actually, because building those relationships with government, given that COVID has dominated everything, before that Brexit dominated everything, the rate that people in government change, I think, is faster than it's ever been. So quite often we'll spend a lot of time getting somewhere and then things will change. And I think, I mean, the disappointing thing for me in the comprehensive spending review is, you know, we've done a lot of work and messages have gone in the right places with various departments, but to create a levelling up fund of only £4 billion and for those decisions to be made centrally on who will and who won't benefit, for me is a step backwards. David may have a more optimistic view than I have.
I think this is a common theme. We read the same document and perhaps look at it in different ways. You know, what I will say is, have government listened intently to what we've said and acted upon everything we've done? Everything we said? No, of course they haven't. I will give them the excuse of it's a mad situation at the minute. This is not normal. Have they listened to some of the things we've said? And do I believe there's enough hooks and ideas in the the spending review, as opposed to the comprehensive spending review, to do something interesting over the next year as a series of pilots? Yes, I do. But that's going to involve Katie, Ben, me, and the rest of the Tech Cluster Group, you know, being very, very proactive with government, or else, you know, it will just end up being the normal programs in the normal way, despite the fact them being called pilots. So, you know, I think it's the door is ajar. We just need to put our shoulder to it and push in a bit harder.
So it's quite noticeable that we're talking about the regions as being distinct from London. Is that right? There's no representation from the London trade body, even if there is such a thing. Is there a difference between the regions and our nation's capital? Ben, what do you think as a southerner?
Away from Blackburn. I think, yeah, absolutely. Oddly, the call I was on before this was with a roundtable with the Lord Mayor of the City of London, who had deigned to come out and was telling us about how they really care about the regions and that sort of the patronising tour that a lot of London people do on a fairly regular basis. But I think, you know, there's absolutely strengths in the size and the scale of what is being developed and what is happening in London. But one of the things we've seen here, and I know it's something that's echoed in some of the other hubs and clusters across the UK, is we also have some special things, and there's some things that we have that you don't have in London. So one of the things we talk about quite a lot here is you can't be a bad actor. So if you are within the Bristol and Bath community and you don't act very well, and occasionally people do, it's all 2 degrees of separation. Everybody knows everybody, everybody's involved in everybody. Admittedly, a lot of it is because I spend all my time going around gossiping and telling everybody everything. But what that means is it's very easy to connect in. It's very easy to collaborate and do things in a way that you just couldn't do in London. But you also have to act almost in a way where you do accept that you pay things forward and you do give things back. Because if you are someone who is just in it for themselves and are happy to effectively screw people over, that gets round and it doesn't work for you. So while scale is fantastic, and obviously London has a global brand, there are things that they don't have that we need to play up more on. And I know that's something that David certainly sees in Sunderland, and I know Katie seems to know everybody in Manchester, and they all spend all their time talking to one another on Twitter. So there's definitely those things we have in common that they don't have, and that's why we treat them differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. We say big enough but small enough, big enough to scale but small enough that everybody does know everybody, and that makes meaningful collaboration possible. And as you say, we do tend to keep each other honest. David, do you have a view of the regions versus London?
Yeah, it's probably a really simplistic one. Everything good can't just happen in London. There has to be good activity,
regardless of what they think.
Well, there has to be good activity going on elsewhere. You know, to give a really probably poor example is you can't have a world-class Industry 4.0 sector devolved out, you know, in London, because they don't have the manufacturers to be able to trial things with. Now, there are opportunities in the northwest, the northeast to do that, in Birmingham to do that. And it's all about having a jigsaw of what makes the UK good and what makes the UK tech sector competitive. And, you know, there are differences between London and the regions, but there are also differences between one region and another region. And some things that we do in the Tech Cluster Group will be transferable and you can learn from, and some things won't. You know, I'm sure Ben and Katie, you've got some fantastic programs that if you pick them up and drop them into the Northeast, they wouldn't work because of local nuances. But that's exactly the fact and the reason why we're here, is because if government believe you can just develop something in the center and parachute it in and it will work perfectly, they are wrong. So we just need to tell them about those nuances and make sure that they understand those nuances. So when they do things, it has a proper impact in the right area at the right time.
So we're, as ever, talking about what regional and national government should do. But what about our members? In all honesty, are we doing enough, from the corporates to the scale-ups to the startups? Or is everybody kind of looking after themselves a little bit too much, particularly during a time where people's, you know, companies' existential survival is, you know, pretty much on the line in some cases? Is this the time to be asking companies to do even more?
If you want,
Katie?
Katie, go.
Oh, go on.
Okay. No, you go for it, Katie.
So this is, I think this is a very pivotal time, I guess, in some senses. And I think especially when you look at the skills issue, from the fact that Manchester Digital's message around skills has for many years now to companies been, you need to grow your own talent, you need to invest, you need to put the hard work in, if we want to have a talent pool the size and with the skills that we need. And, you know, and some of that is hard. Taking apprentices is hard. Taking people who've reskilled is hard. Companies are used to doing things in a certain way. Pushing yourself to, you know, to look at building your company to be more diverse, all of those things are a bit more challenging. And I think asking companies to do some of that stuff now is definitely difficult. Obviously, we've seen new entry positions dwindle this year as companies aren't going to be able to take the same levels of people. We've seen apprentices drop significantly. And I think whilst, you know, there's a limit to what companies do, I think this is where we need to be really innovative, because in 3 years, as we recover, we'll be back in the same situation. And I think it's also understanding, you know, how do we ensure that the digital industry keep their skills up to date? How do we ensure they're developing for AI? How do we ensure that they're ready for the other stuff that's coming down the pipe? So I think if you're a technology business, you have to think long term. You have to think, you know, 3 to 5 years as opposed to just the next year. Otherwise, I think you're limiting your ability to grow when things do start coming back to normal.
Yeah, Ben or David, anything to add to that? Do you consider it part of your role to push your members to do the right thing, as it were, encourage?
I think one of the things that we've seen and that we all talk about a lot is the value of those networks and communities, and the fact that there are ways for you to, certainly for smaller businesses, to be able to grow by being part of that. And traditionally that sort of lived in the gap where you have spare resource, and this year a lot of people haven't had any spare resource, and that's really understandable. But there's a thing with all of these things around momentum, like Katie was saying. It's not a thing that you can turn on and off like a tap. And if we do turn it off, it will take a long time for it to get back to where it is. So it's certainly difficult. It's certainly something where you really have to dig in to continue to do these things. And it's something that we as organisations are doing as well. But I think that sort of slightly longer term view of where we are as communities is going to be really key. And if we do give up, we're going to really struggle to restart.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. But it is a very, I know myself, it's a very difficult pitch to make at the moment. It's very difficult to talk to meaningfully talk about your long-term plans when you don't really know what next week holds. It's definitely a difficult time. And classically, the things that government will contribute to do require our sector to step up and match and find resources and get bought in. So I do wonder if that will be difficult. David, what do you think of how we might pitch that to our members?
I mean, I think all of our members across the country, no matter what type of organisation you are all clever. I think they understand the world is changing. I think they understand there's multiple facets to an ecosystem. And I do, based on experience, see lots of companies in our ecosystems helping each other. And I think we've just got to be appreciative, and they have to be appreciative of the fact that in times like this, they probably can't help as much as they want to help because they're too busy trying to either pay the bills or focusing on the next product because they need to deliver something rapidly. And I think that's where this symbiosis between our ecosystems and government funding to do things in market failure works really well. I truly think the facets we need to concentrate on moving forward are how do we get the right skilled people into our ecosystems? How do we get more tech companies in our ecosystems? And how do we get more customers in our ecosystems? And what I mean by more customers is more digital adoption. And actually, the members can take part in all of that, but it's probably for somebody else to lead. It's probably for us as organizations to lead on those things to start with. So I think it's just this understanding that we have to do something, and sometimes we lean forward a little bit more and members can lean back because they've got to concentrate on their businesses, because what we don't want them to do is disappear.
So, well, entirely that. So all digital discussions in the end come back down to talent and skills and the fact that we don't have enough of either. Is there anything that's happening around the way that the economy is changing through COVID, generally negatively, that we might be able to work with to increase the flow of people, trained, skilled people into our sector? And how might we do that?
So, I mean, in Manchester, there's a lot of resource being put into Fasttrack skills programs and boot camps. So the 3-month kind of cycle of training people. And I think that is incredibly valuable. And, given the amount of displaced people that we have, I think it's something like Greater Manchester has 70,000 people currently on furlough. And a lot of those jobs won't come back. It's a key thing to do. The problem we had, again, is where employers aren't employing in big volumes. And when you reskill those people, it's another new entry stream. So you've got grads, you've got retrainers, you've got apprentices. They all require a different level of support. And it's actually, how do you make those people useful more quickly? And how do you support them from being that new entrant into kind of progressing at a faster rate? And for me, there's a missing thing about, further enhancing those people's skills and giving them support once they're in those roles, because that's when people leave because they don't feel that the tech sector is the right place for them, or they don't get the opportunity in the first place. So it's trying to fill that gap somehow needs filling. And I'm not hearing anybody talk about how we resource or manage that at the moment.
No, it's a very difficult problem to solve. It typically, after people have come through a kind of retraining boot camp type setup, you are looking at maybe 2 years before people are truly independent and autonomous in their roles, and companies have to find a way of supporting during that time. It does absolutely work out, but it's very difficult for any company. It's very difficult to do at volume, I think. I don't know if David or Ben, you're seeing any companies in your areas that are doing anything innovative with trying to fast track people through.
Perhaps not companies. Well, no, this is unfair. Some companies are doing it, but I'm going to look at this whole problem from a slightly different perspective. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there isn't a lack of skilled people out there, but I do think there is a percentage of individuals out there who could do the job, but aren't getting the opportunity because recruitment processes are antiquated. You know, especially in some of the bigger players, there's still a CV sift. You know, and really, if you take a CV and go, well, there's no experience, that person, put them in the bin, or there is experience but there's no qualification, put them in the bin. All of those people with CVs in the bin can't be bad. And with a little bit of a hypothesis around this, we've started to pilot something in the Northeast where we're working with the demand side. We're trying to get employers to recruit in different ways, and that's simple things like not just doing a CV sift, but also making job adverts more appropriate, whether that's for diversity or whether it's skill level or background level or language. Because we've all been there, we've all written job descriptions that basically specify a unicorn. You know, it has to be a lovely white horse, it has to have a horn, shove some wings on there as well because we like that. And if you don't have that unicorn sitting out there in a stable, you don't get them applying. So let's just try something on the demand side as well as doing some more stuff on the supply side.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you still cringe every time you see adverts looking for rock stars and ninjas and other generally male types. Yeah, I think a lot of digital companies have moved on in that. But I still think Katie's probably right that there's a missing support that probably needs to be introduced somehow for us to really get people through in volume. So to finish off, if you could pick one of your recommendations, one of the 7, get it landed, get it implemented, which one would be your favourite and why? Ben?
I suspect David, Katie, and I all have different ones because we all have different things. So it's brilliant that you asked me first because it's easiest for me. One of the things that's slightly different from some of what we've talked about, but I think is going to be an increasing problem if we don't resolve it now, is a focus on very early stage startups. So certainly where I am in the country, there are huge numbers of businesses being set up. Some of that is because people are leaving their current roles, and there really isn't very much specific support. And what that's meaning at the moment is lots of people are spending what resource they have doing something that actually could fairly easily be solved, and to be saying, well, you're wasting your time on this, or you should be looking at X, Y, Z. So I don't think that is a massive problem to solve. And I guess that's why it would be my, if I had a gun to Boris Johnson's head, that would be the one thing I would be asking. Well, probably wouldn't be the one thing I'd be asking about. I'd have lots of things to ask about. But if I had to pick a recommendation, I think that's the one where I think it's really low-hanging fruit. It's not, it's effectively something that we could start and make a big difference really quickly with relatively little money. And if COVID has taught me one thing, anything we can do that's really easy and we can get through quickly would be something that we should be focused on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I've heard the phrase furloughpreneurs or something like that, but there's definitely a massive uptick in people having a bit of a rethink and maybe trying to launch that idea that they've had burning away for a couple of years. So I think you're probably right. Some reasonably easy to provide support could go a very long way. David?
If we don't deliver schemes that aren't nuanced to the local sectors in which we work in the local ecosystems, we failed. If government, for example, invests money into what Ben's just talked about, but doesn't appreciate that it needs to be slightly nuanced and different shaped towards the tech sector in different areas, you might as well put the money in a bonfire and burn it. So nuancing things to local delivery is absolutely fundamental. And there's not an easy get out clause there. There's not a right, well, we'll give it to our local growth hub because they know exactly what's going on, because that's not nuance towards the tech sector. So my recommendation is nuance towards the ecosystem and nuance towards the tech sector.
Thank you. And final word to you, Katie. If government would absolutely implement one Gallagher idea, what would it be?
Well, I think they have to do two. So I agree with everything that my esteemed colleagues have said thus far. But I also think, and especially for the North, I think we need to do the digital transformation thing for businesses and the digital reskilling thing in tandem at scale and sustained for several years. And actually, if governments really genuinely want to level up the regions, that's what they need to do, and they need to put more than £4 billion behind it. Potentially.
Yeah, I think we can. I think we can all agree on that one. Well, thank you very much, panel. That was very interesting, and thank you everybody for joining our general meeting today.